thank the chair. A couple of quick questions, well, really a question and then a comment. First, I want to thank each of the sponsors for their testimony today, and of course the ranking member as well for his testimony on a variety of different bills that obviously warrant our consideration. In particular, of course, with respect to the bill that's been offered by Representative Griffith, I co-chair the Fentanyl Prevention Caucus in the House, and so this is a subject I care deeply about and believe, as the ranking member said, that we need to implement a whole-of-government approach on a bipartisan basis to address the scourge of fentanyl that is devastating so many communities across the country, mine included. I wanted to ask you actually a question, not so much about the substance of your bill, but going to a point that my colleague articulated so well, Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania, and that is regarding the amendments. I'm sure you've seen there's a robust submission of amendments, and as my colleague on the other side of the aisle mentioned, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from sponsors on that front. I guess I just wonder, your personal opinion, do you think this committee should consider those amendments and have an opportunity to be able to, on the floor, give members an opportunity to have an up or down vote on some of the amendments that have been presented? And let me preface that with saying, I know there are some members on the other side of the aisle who earlier this year, during the process in which this Congress was initiated and the rules were adopted, that made much of supposed rule changes and trying to bring this institution back into a place in which there was open debate, and I count you among them. And I think you've always been intellectually honest on that front. And so I'm hopeful that you might provide this committee with some direction about considering the robust pool of amendments that have been proposed. Because I'm worried that as you exit the room, that my colleagues, unfortunately, on the other side of the aisle may become a bit reluctant.
Yeah, and I will just tell you, you know, when you look at germaneness, there are different opinions on my side of the aisle too, but the reason, and I talked to the parliamentarians about it, the reason I got some language change was so that we could change that rule. It is my fervent belief that we need to change that rule and that the mechanism that was put in place allows us to change that rule. And what we should be looking at is, does the amendment directly impact what the bill's intent and purpose is? This bill's intent doesn't have anything to do with mandatory minimums. That's a completely different discussion. So I would submit to you that a large number of the amendments are not germane to the bill. And once people start getting used to figuring out how to draft under the new construct, draft those amendments, sure, I think we'll be in better shape. And the best place to start is right here in the Rules Committee. We will probably have some floor fights. I'm hopeful before the end of the year we'll have some floor fights over the defining of germaneness. I mean, what people don't seem to realize is that the precedents that are set are not there to bind us, but to guide us. And what we have done is we've gotten to a point where we're completely bound by precedents that in some cases don't make sense and have gotten too broad. We've allowed too much, in my opinion, on germaneness, which is why I fought to get some rules changes related to single purpose. This bill has a pretty straightforward single purpose. And I think that all of the mandatory minimum amendments are clearly not germane to the purpose and intent of this bill. This bill is about research and about scheduling fentanyl analogs, nothing else, not any other drug substance, not anything directly related to mandatory minimums, and therefore I believe that
I hear you, and so
not germane.
And I think you answered my question. So a couple of points I'd make. First, with respect to germaneness, my understanding is there wasn't an actual change to the rule, but nonetheless, let's just take you at your
changed.
I hear you. I take you at your word, sir. And I guess what I'm asking about are the germane amendments. So there are many amendments that have been submitted by Republican members of your caucus that are germane to this bill. There are a few from Democrats as well. And I'm just asking you if you think we ought to be able to consider those amendments and have up or down votes, because to me, that would be consistent with your worldview that you've articulated previously.
If it is truly and not in violation of single purpose
Sure.
or germaneness, yes.
All right. Well, I hope that the chair and your colleagues here will give you the courtesy of adhering to that wise counsel that you've offered this committee, because there are a number of amendments, as I said, on both sides of the aisle, been submitted by members across the Congress that are germane, that I think merit consideration by the committee. Mr. Johnson, I want to just talk briefly about the CRA. And I guess I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, because I had followed some of the debate in the Senate rather closely, Senator Fisher, of course, being the prime sponsor of the CRA that's now before the House. And my understanding of the argument that they made, I say they, maybe painting with a broad brush here, but several of the Republican senators who were championing this CRA, was the argument that emissions had improved pretty significantly over the course of the last several decades, certainly far different than the trucks that were being built in the 1990s. I assume you agree with that.
I do.
And is it your position that that change has nothing to do with the rule that was promulgated by the EPA in 2001?
What I can tell you is that we have already achieved a 98% reduction in NOx.
And why is that?
Since 1988. That's a long time before 2001.
Yeah,
And this rule outpaces available technology. The technology is not even there to do what they're proposing.
I hear your argument on that latter point, and I heard your testimony on that front, so I hear what you're saying. I'm taking a step back, because your argument seems different than the argument that was articulated in the Senate. Even in the Senate, the Republican senators, I think, were making the argument that the 2001 rule promulgated by the EPA ultimately enabled the industry to drastically improve the emissions over the course of the ensuing 2 decades, right, 20 years.
I wouldn't dare say that it didn't have any effect, but I would also, without qualification, say it didn't have the total effect. Some of this came from industry.
I'm not saying it had a total effect, but I am saying that the empirical studies and certainly the EPA's data that it's published and your colleagues in the Senate who support the CRA, they all concede that the 2001 rule had a substantial impact in decreasing emissions. And they nonetheless support the CRA for the reasons that you've articulated around technology, and I heard your testimony on that front. But for me, I guess what is a bit confounding is to have folks who bemoan regulation and demand that we don't move forward with this regulation, which we know, based on the analysis that the EPA has done, will save lives, will reduce cases of childhood asthma across the country, in Ohio, in western and northern Colorado, where I hail from, and would save ultimately billions of dollars over the course of the long haul going into 2045, that we shouldn't pursue the rule change because it won't be effective. And yet, they cite as justification the fact that the prior rule that the EPA promulgated in 2001 was in fact effective. And who knew that ultimately it would have an impact, as it did. Ranking Member Pallone, do you care to expound on any of this?
I just want to say this, and maybe I just keep coming here for these CRAs and I'm getting disgusted with it, but I mean, it just seems like, I know you guys are going to take this in the wrong way, but look, we have a committee that deals with all these pollution issues, EPA, health issues, safety, whatever. To me, using the CRA process, which precludes any further regulation in this space, is not the way to proceed legislatively around here. What I'm seeing is more and more Republican, the majority, bringing to the floor these CRAs that preclude, if they were ultimately signed into law, that would preclude us dealing with all these health and safety issues. It's not the way to legislate. I mean, I don't think anyone, Mr. Johnson is suggesting that we shouldn't be doing something about heavy-duty trucks now or in the future. Yet if you pass this thing and it became law, we wouldn't be able to do that. And I know that's not what you wanted me to discuss, but I mean, I just want to say it's getting to the point where every week there's another CRA, and the consequence of all this, if it actually became law, would be devastating to health and safety for the country.
No, you raise a great point, Ranking Member Pallone, and Mr. Johnson, to the extent that you would care to respond on this front, I would certainly welcome it. Well, let me give you a question here and throw it your way, and then you can respond, because the Ranking Member raises a really interesting point. sitting on this committee, we've done a lot of CRAs. It has been a CRA-intensive start to the 118th Congress, which I suspect some folks on your side of the aisle take pride in. And what I would say is you've served in Congress long. I'm looking at Mr. Massey, his big thumbs up. But I started my tenure in Congress in the 116th Congress. You've served, of course, longer than I have. When I started in the 116th Congress with my colleague, Ms. Scanlon, Donald Trump was president, as you might recall, 2019. The president, the administration, had promulgated hundreds of rules across a bevy of different federal agencies during the preceding 2 years. Do you know how many CRAs we considered in the 116th Congress? You and I.
Wow.
18 CRAs? Two CRAs in the 116th Congress. 2. So, again,
I'd have to go back and look.
you can check the notes, and we'll be here for a while. To Ranking Member Pallone's point, the CRA is a hammer, right, as opposed to a finely tuned scalpel as we're addressing some of these really nuanced policy challenges. And I think they are best reserved for thoughtful consideration in the subcommittee that you chair, in the full committee that Ranking Member Pallone serves on, rather than just doing a CRA basically every week. I mean, it's got a lot of challenges that we're facing as a country. Would like to be able to consider legislation like your colleague, Mr. Griffith's legislation on fentanyl, which I appreciate, him bringing forward in front of this committee. So anyway, I'm happy to give you a chance to respond, but
Yeah.
of course.
Well, first of all, let me say that the CRA process, I think, is there for a reason. It's part and parcel to Congress's oversight responsibility of the administration, and sometimes, given the criticality of the issue, I think a CRA is the appropriate way to go. And quite honestly, I've been here for 13 years. I don't think we've considered that many CRAs since I've been here in 13 years. And the ones that we did were very important ones. The other thing that I would
From
like to
19,
point
if
out-
I might just comment there, I'll give you a chance.
If I might finish.
Sure.
One of the main reasons why this one is so important is because the rule is not going to accomplish what the EPA is trying to accomplish. They've admitted that this thing is going to cost somewhere between 39 and 55 billion, which the cost is largely going to be borne by the American consumers because small and independent truck fleet owners are not going to be able to afford to go to these newer trucks with the $8,000 cost associated with them or the $2,000 for the F-250. And so they're going to stay with the old technology. So we're going to keep the old trucks on the road longer. And so we're going to actually slow down the process of reducing NOx emissions.
And I hear your argument, Mr. Johnson. The EPA clearly has a different view. But with respect to the CRA, just because you're actually right on this point. I don't know how long you served in Congress. I know, again, this was longer than I have. But CRA was adopted by Congress in 1996. It wasn't used a single time until 2017. So you're right. For the vast majority.
Yeah, I was the one that introduced it, to get rid of the string protection rule, and I'm sure as hell glad that I did.
Well, and look, no one's making that case. No one's arguing that the CRA isn't a tool that should and can be used by the Congress from time to time. What I am saying is that the House Republican majority has chosen to spend its very limited floor time on 6 CRAs over the course of the last 4 months, which is 3 times the amount of CRAs that were considered when House, hold on, Mr. Johnson, I let you finish, I'm going to finish my statement, that House Democrats utilized during the course of the final 2 years of the Trump presidency. And so, look, I mean, I go back to Mr. Griffith's comments about, I think returning this place to regular order and applying sort of an institutionalist view to the Congress. If this is the system, and we're just going to have a Congress, as it switches back and forth and the political winds shift, and we'll consider 10 to 20, 30, 40 CRAs every year, depending on which party's in power. I guess that's the system that some would like to adopt. I don't think it's a particularly productive system. That's the point I'm making. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my
Mr.
time.
Chairman, may I respond to that last?
I'm happy to, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to yield to you, of course.
I would say that there is certainly a time and a place for CRAs, and I think one of the reasons why you see this one, and I'm sure this is going to generate a lot more discussion, we had the best economy that we'd had in 50 years under the previous administration. Today, we got the highest inflation that we've had in more than 40 years. There's a reason to pull back on the regulations coming out of the Biden administration, and the CRA is a valid way to do it, and that's what we should do.
Well, I will just say, since we're here on the dais and we like to have the last word, because I wanted to give you an opportunity, but the response I don't think was germane to the argument that I was making. So I will simply conclude by saying it seems to me that your view, pretty clearly, is a CRA a month, 2 CRAs a month, 3 CRAs a month. We should just keep doing CRAs, and that is fine. You're entitled to that view. I don't think it's a particularly productive way for us to do our business. We're going to have an opportunity in a minute, Mr. Massey. Why give you that time now? And again, we could talk about the merits about the rule as well, as I said, and the various ways in which I think it will benefit the American public. Obviously, we have a disagreement about that on the merits. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from